Okay, so tonight's program, Chester Waite was a longtime resident of Lynnfield. He was a maker of dollhouse furniture and accessories, working from the 1930s to the 1950s. During the 1930s, he set up a shop in his garage as a cottage industry to make dollhouse furniture. His dollhouse furniture, which is officially called Lynnfield Dollhouse Furniture, was sold throughout the country in large department and toy stores such as FAO Schwartz. His work is documented, well-known, and collected by dollhouse furniture collectors. Upon Mr. Waite's death, his wife Tilly, a well-respected science teacher at the Lynnfield Junior High School, had a local craftsman build a replica of their home on Canterbury Road so she could display her husband's work. The dollhouse was proudly displayed in her front window for all to see. Upon retiring to Arizona, Mrs. Waite donated the dollhouse to the Lynnfield Historical Society. Tonight's speaker is Abby Chandler, PhD from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. When she was old enough to appreciate them, Professor Chandler was given several pieces of Chester Waite doll furniture from her mother's collection that had been purchased in Philadelphia in the 1950s. Last year, she contacted the Lynnfield Historical Society and offered to donate her collection to be preserved where they were made many years ago. The Society is honored to accept her bequest. Please welcome Professor Abby Chandler.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me. So I'm used to talking about history, but the history I talk about is usually the history of the 16 and 1700s because I have spent my career as an early Americanist. So this is very different because this is a large part of my history. And this is a story that begins, and my first slide please, with the 3 children in this picture. And this is my mother right here, Tanya Thurlow Chandler, her older sister, Daphne Thurlow Stevens, and their youngest, the youngest of the family, her brother Chip Thurlow. And my mother's family is originally from Massachusetts. Her family came over in the 1600s and settled in Holliston, Massachusetts. But her childhood was spent in Wilmington, Delaware. And as a child, she and her older sister Daphne were given a dollhouse, which included some Chester Waite furniture. You can do the next slide. So the pictures here are all pieces of furniture from my mother's dollhouse collection. And I don't actually know what my mother's dollhouse looked like. I remember her telling me stories about playing with it. The problem is I was a kid who was very into dollhouses, and so I have an image of what this dollhouse looked like in my mind, but I don't know if that's her dollhouse or if that's a dollhouse that I read about in a book that I'm picturing. So her dollhouse for me is still a bit of a mystery. But she did have her furniture collection, and when my mother was 18, her parents were divorced and the family home in Wilmington was sold, and the dollhouse was sold. My mother didn't have a space to keep it, which again is why the dollhouse is a bit of a mystery to me, but she packed up all the furniture. And she saved it, clearly hoping that someday she might have a daughter of her own. So, next slide please. We go forward a little bit further in my mother's history. She had moved to Massachusetts with her mother in the late 1960s, and she met my father, John Chandler, who also, it was from a family in Massachusetts, Sterling, Massachusetts, and they were married in 1970, and then I was born in 1974. So this is a picture of my mother holding me when I was a baby, and my father is from a family that to this day still loves sailing. So this picture was taken on board Doucette, who was a schooner from the early 1900s that my parents did a lot of sailing on when I was very young. And apparently my first word was sailboat. So we're gonna jump forward in time again. And we're now up to 1978, and I was 4, almost 5, and this is me around that age. And my father decided to make me a dollhouse for Christmas that year. And my birthday is in February, so in December I would have been 4 and 10 months. And at the time my mother was pregnant with my youngest sister. So I'm wondering if part of this was I was about to have to go through the adjustment to another younger sibling. And my theory is the dollhouse was seen as, well, maybe this will distract her from all those younger siblings. Whatever the case, the next slide, please. I came down Christmas morning, and we lived in North Andover, Massachusetts at that time. And I have this very vivid memory of coming down the stairs and the dollhouse underneath the tree. And at the time, the dollhouse was unfinished. So this is a picture I took recently of it. So at the time it was the wooden house with the outline, and there was a swing in the doorway, which I looked and looked and looked for and couldn't find. So that's my first memory of this dollhouse and it coming into my life. And as I mentioned, I was 4, almost 5, and you are not going to give a 4-year-old, however careful she might be, the incredibly fragile pieces of furniture. But you can go on to the next slide. But my mother did have some pieces of furniture that were quite sturdy. So the pictures I'm going to show you now are the first pieces from my mother's collection that she gave me. And the clock there is actually a piggy bank. And so there's a screw in the back and you can undo it. And I acquired a habit as a child, whenever I saw a coin in the ground or the street, I would pick it up and I would put those coins in the clock penny bank as a way of saving up money for additional things for my dollhouse. We eventually moved to South Hamilton, and any of you who are familiar with Wenham might be familiar with the Wenham Museum, which has a dollhouse collection. And when I was a child, their gift shop had a lot of dollhouse things. So my allowances and my penny here, nickel there, it was a big day when I found a quarter on the ground, were going on collecting small things. So this is some of that first furniture from my mother, and then the next slide. All of these are pieces made by a company called Renwall, and they are amazingly detailed. And I opened up the stove. So the stove, one of the drawers on the stove. So the stove would fold down, the drawers would pull out, so you could put pots and pans in it. The dishwasher there has the rack, there's the sink. The sewing machine over here, you can fold the sewing machine down, and this part you can crank it and the needle goes up and down. So again, it's incredibly detailed. And then the next slide, please. And this was one other thing from my mother's collection that I inherited at this time, which is this set of copper. There are dishes here, there's a frying pan, there's a double boiler, a saucepan, a coffee pot, a tea kettle. So this is when my dollhouse was first coming into my life, and I adored it and played with it constantly. And next picture. We're up to December of 1982. This is a picture of me taken at around that time. And I was going through the slides with my husband, and he looked at it and said, "That's a picture of you at your grandparents' house in Maine. That is not a picture of you at the house in South Hamilton." And I said, "Yes, but that's a picture of me of about that time period." So Christmas of 1982, and my mother decided that I was ready for the Chester Waite furniture. So the pieces here are the ones that I received that year when I was 8, almost 9. So next slide, please. So again, you can see all of them there. There's a little bedside table, a couple of tables those right there. And then the next slide. These are my favorite pieces of them. And the desk, it looks like an actual desk. If you could wave a magic wand and blow it up to full size, it would be a fully functioning desk. This folds down, the drawers come out. Oh, that's right. I forgot. I left some of the desk things in it, which is fine, they can stay. So I had a little tiny telephone, a quilt pen right there. But my favorite, and next slide please, was the break front, which apparently is the official name for it. I always called it the bookcase. And when my maternal grandmother was buying these items of furniture in Philadelphia for her daughter's dollhouse, one of the things she did was to create these pieces of paper here where she drew on it to make it look as if there were books in the shelves. So there's this one. She also found some smaller pieces of plastic, again, to give that idea of books. By the 1980s, when I was playing with my dollhouse, they were starting to manufacture little tiny dollhouse books. They're blank, but they have actual pages, and some of them actually come with book titles. So some of those are included. There's Cinderella, Laura Ingalls Wilder, and so those books are some of the ones that I was buying from the Wenham Museum at that time. And around that time, 1982 into the spring of 1983, my fascination with my dollhouse really got sort of this big surge forward. Next slide. In March of 1983, my mother took my sisters and me to Washington, D.C. to visit my paternal grandparents. My grandfather, Nathan Chandler, was a farmer here in Massachusetts for many years, and in 1970 he was made the first agricultural consultant to the Environmental Protection Agency. And his job was to travel around the country talking to farmers about investing in agriculture, and the idea was that, yes, he was college educated, he'd been to Yale, but he'd also been a farmer, so he could say to a farmer, well, this might be a good idea, something for you to think about, and be taken more seriously than somebody who was just a politician or a bureaucrat, because he had been farming here in Massachusetts for years and years and years. So my mother brought my sisters and me, as I said, to Washington, D.C. And one of the many places, my grandmother took us to museum after museum after museum. I was in heaven. And one of the museums she took us to was the National Museum of American History. And next slide, please. If anybody has ever been there, they have an amazing dollhouse in their collection. It's still in their collection. The last time I was in D.C. in 2011, I went to see it. And I spent as much time as my family was willing to allow me looking at it floor by floor by floor by floor by floor by floor. But as I was looking at it, I noticed that some of the pieces of furniture in that house looked very familiar. So, next slide. So this is a close-up of the library. And next slide, please. This is a close-up of Mr. Dahl's study. And as all of you have probably noticed, that furniture, some of it looks very, very familiar. So next slide, please. The desk and the chair. So back a slide, please. There's the desk and the chair, and then also the break front. And that was when it first dawned on me at the age of 9 that this furniture had to have some significance if the woman who created the world's most amazing dollhouse that became part of the Smithsonian collection had some of the same furniture that I had. So I had no idea it was furniture from Essex County, which is where I was growing up. But that was when it first started to hit in my mind that, okay, this is something to be extra careful with. And on that same trip, and so we're going to go forward, let's see. So forward, okay, stop. That same trip, at that time, the Smithsonian Museum of American History sold dollhouse items in their gift store. And my grandfather bought me these two pieces, platter of corn, and this one over here is a mailbox. So this lifts up, you can put mail in, you can put a newspaper there. So those also became part of my collection. And then, next slide, please. My grandmother also took us to one of the many other museums we went to. It was Flora Gill Jacobs' Washington Dollhouse and Toy Museum. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this museum. As part of my trip, I created a scrapbook, and this is my page from the scrapbook on the Flora Gill Jacobs Museum. So we went to the Doll Museum. My favorite page, by the way, from the scrapbook is we went to the DAR Museum. It was lots of fun. And I came across this scrapbook a couple of years ago and looked at it and just laughed at my 9-year-old self, who clearly was an American history professor already in training at that particular point in time. But Flora Gill Jacobs' her dollhouse collection began with this house here. She bought it in the 1940s. It was known as the South Jersey House because she bought it from an antique dealer in southern New Jersey. And she had a Siamese cat named Annie, you can see here. And Flora Gill Jacobs wrote a number of histories of dollhouses, but she also wrote 2 children's books about this dollhouse in her collection. So, next slide. So she wrote the Dollhouse Mystery, and then she wrote another one called the Toy Shop Mystery. And so while we were visiting her museum, my grandmother introduced us to her and bought both the books, which Flora Gill Jacobs then autographed, and I still have those as part of my collection. And again, this is just a nod to the future American history professor in training. There's a passage in the Toy Shop Museum. So next slide, please. Which, coming into these rooms, was like entering the past. And this is being told from the perspective of the 8 or 9-year-old heroine, who of course, of these books, who of course is the same age as me. They were as neat as the front of the shop, but there was something about heavy old furniture that always seemed to Priscilla a little strange and dark and far away. Perhaps it was just these things were from the past. She was glad she wasn't alone. And I remember reading that passage at the age of 9 and being totally struck by the fact that, yeah, I had that same sense of old things being from the past. Priscilla is freaked out by this. I was intrigued. I wanted more stuff from the past. So again, this is part of that early history starting to lay down the groundwork that would eventually lead to me becoming a history professor. But in the meantime, I am still a kid who is obsessed with dollhouses. And next slide. So this is a picture of my bedroom, circa 1985. By this point in time, the dollhouse had become the centerpiece of a fictional town, or fictional in my head, known as Harborville. This is actually something I never told my parents about, and all of you outside of my husband are the first people I've ever told any of this to, because I had my dollhouse. I had little toy mice I was making homes for. I had rabbits I was making homes for. I had other dolls. And if you look really carefully, there's a playground set up here. There's a general store set up here. There's a schoolhouse here. One of the dollhouses I constructed here. The mice lived on a windowsill. The strange little creatures lived up on another windowsill. And this really became the centerpiece of my world at that particular point in time. So this very elaborate internal world that, again, I never told anyone about. I mean, obviously my parents could see all of this, but it was just this my own private imaginary world that I never really told anyone about at this time. But this is also the period where my father and I were finishing my dollhouse. So next slide. And this is it in its sort of height of the finishing of it. So we put down linoleum in the kitchen, and I had created a stencil. I'll show you an individual picture. And by now you're familiar with the Chester Waite pieces. So next slide, please. I'll take you through the rooms. So here's the kitchen with that stencil that I had made around the top, and the stove and the sink and the dishwasher for my mother. The next room, the dining room. So in my mother's original dollhouse, these had been the dining room furniture, but the dining room table and the other pieces of furniture didn't survive the getting passed down to me, so I had a different dining room table. Next slide, please. This is the living room, and you can see the break front right there, that table. I also inherited my mother's dollhouse dolls, and her dollhouse also had several animals. And the dollhouse family were called Johnson. I don't know why I called them Johnson, but this is Mr. Johnson. And I realized as I was putting this together, I don't know what Mr. and Mrs. Johnson's first names were, because I was a child, and adults are known as Mr. and Mrs. So to this day, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson do not have first names. But here is Mr. Johnson with two of their dogs. And next slide, please. This is Lucy. There were also two boy dolls from my mother, but I was in a family of girls, and I was the oldest daughter, and I'm afraid the boy dolls got relegated to the attic, and they really did not have any fun. Lucy had a lovely room because Lucy was the oldest girl in the family. And there's the Chester Waite bureau. The green rocking chair is actually a piece of furniture from my father's side of the family. My paternal grandmother did not have a dollhouse, but she grew up in Hawaii. She had that green rocking chair, and she had a little doll from Japan, who I still also have, who came with that rocking chair. So here's Lucy in her room. Her cat was also part of my mother's collection. And next slide, please. So the bathroom right there, and there's the blue plastic washing machine back there, and the bathroom furniture also has an Essex County connection. I don't know if anybody remembers the Hayscales Exchange in North Andover, Massachusetts. I lived in North Andover as a child. My mother was very involved with Hayscales, and there was a woman who was making the bathroom fittings. I'm guessing she bought them and then painted them. Anyway, they came from Hayscales. So another Essex County connection there. And then the next slide. And this is Mr. and Mrs. Johnson's room. There's Mrs. Johnson, the desk, and the other two bureaus there. So this is what my dollhouse was like at the height of my childhood by playing with it. But I, of course, grew up in 1996. My father, who had been head of the Pingree School in South Hamilton, became the head of a high school in Turkey. And so my parents moved to Turkey. That same year I graduated from college, I moved to Kentucky to start my museum career, working at a tiny museum in Western Kentucky. My dollhouse went into storage at that particular point in time, but I eventually got a PhD in history, got hired by UMass Lowell, moved back to Eastern Massachusetts, bought a house, and finally had space. So my dollhouse has been in my house in North Andover the last several years, but over the last couple of years, I've started to think about, okay, what is going to happen next to it, given that I did not have children of my own, so I don't have a daughter to pass it on to. I do have nieces, but they are now in their late teens. None of them are particularly interested in dollhouses, but my mother and I made the decision that my dollhouse would go to my parents' house in Maine to be played with by great-grandchildren whenever they come along. But we were both concerned about the Chester Waite furniture, because if the dollhouse was passing into future great-grandchildren, I was worried about them being played with a little too hard and not having the kind of control that my mother had, where she could decide, all right, I'm giving you the plastic furniture when you're 4, but you're not getting the really good furniture till you're older. We wouldn't have that ability to manage it. And also there was that back of my mind, I saw this furniture at the Smithsonian, so there must be possible some significance to it. And so last summer, I started doing image searches for wooden dollhouse furniture from the 1950s. And next slide, please. And just searching images until I came across the website of a woman named Susan Hale, who collects dollhouses, and about 5 years ago had bought this dollhouse off of Craigslist. She called it Middleton Manor, and she had made the decision to furnish it entirely with, as she put it, Lynnfield furniture. So next slide, please. This is an excerpt from her blog. And this is when I put together the pieces of, I grew up in Essex County, and this is furniture that belonged to my mother, who grew up in Delaware, but her family is also from Massachusetts, and the two of us for decades played with furniture from Massachusetts, and we had absolutely no idea. And this is when I had contacted the Lynnfield Historical Society. And next slide, please. Here's another picture from Susan Hale's Middleton Manor. So again, you can see why I was able to put together these pieces. And then another one from here, again, the same desk. And my guess is that there's a version of those chairs without the armrests that just didn't survive my mother's childhood. And next slide. This is the final one. And this is the piece of the story that all of you know. And I cannot tell you how happy I am to know that this furniture that was such a huge part of my childhood is going to now be preserved. As I've mentioned, I'm a historian. I worked in the museum field for years. History matters to me. Preserving matters to me. Thank you for giving my